Before the pandemic, supply chain wasn't something most Americans thought about. When it said supply chains, you look at each other with a blank stare. Think how many people had no idea what the heck a supply chain was. No, I'm serious. For example, during the pandemic, what happened was all of a sudden everybody started to learn the phrase supply chain. A year ago, no one knew what the hell everybody was talking about when he said supply chain. But now they all know.
Do you get the feeling that Joe Biden himself didn't know? Every time I hear him say that line, I think to myself, that's just a man being honest that the 9,000-year-old senator, VP, now president, legit just didn't even know what a supply chain was. Ross knows. Joining me now, my buddy Ross Kennedy, founder of Fortis Analysis and an expert on supply chains. Okay, Ross, well, Joe Biden just found out about them, but you've known about them for quite some time, and everyone knows we had massive problems during the pandemic, if we're still calling it that. Are the supply chain problems from the pandemic, are they worked out?
Well, I think in a lot of ways we've gone the other direction. Before we couldn't get anything into the U.S., we had a serious lack of availability of everything, pretty much except toilet paper, it felt like, despite people's panic buying. Now we're in a situation where for a lot of stores, the story's really been the last 6 to 12 months. Inventories are full. Things have caught up. Everything that they were ordering, just desperately trying to get into the U.S., and that could be consumer goods, different staple goods that people require, things like clothing or electronics, whatever it may be. Inventories are full now, and we're seeing demand collapsing in the ocean freight market, particularly between China and other parts of Southeast Asia and the U.S. And so now it's a situation we've gone the other way, the sort of the classic bullwhip effect. But the devastating fallout of all of this is that companies couldn't make enough money during the pandemic importing and manufacturing. Now they can't make money for a different reason, which is that most people aren't buying at this point.
Okay, why aren't people buying? Is this just an economy problem, an inflation problem? Why aren't people buying? Because we are, if I remember right, about a 70% consumer-based economy. So if people aren't buying things, that's a problem.
It's a huge problem. Yeah, from the revenue-generating side for a lot of these companies, if they're not in the service industry, which really we're kind of a financialized service economy. To the extent that we do manufacture some things for ourselves, it tends to be a lot of core things, but consumer goods is another massive, massive driver of the U.S. economy, and that's falling apart. People are not buying mainly because of inflation is a big one. When you look at the price of a vehicle, a truck that's $70,000, now it was $40,000 just really a few years ago, home values are up. So people are spending money on the things that they still really kind of consider essential to their life. But because they're not getting, Uncle Sam bucks falling from the sky because we're in our 17th straight lockdown, because things are not hard to come by and people are almost panic purchasing for things that they really want, now they've sort of retracted their spending and going back to, what's important. And as things, as the economy has really opened up over the last year and a half, people are going back to spending on services as well. They're spending on experiences. They're going back to restaurants more, it's so as these dynamics have shifted, inventories are filling up. Vessels are coming across the ocean, no longer full. The ocean carriers are panicking. The railroads are panicking. There's a bloodbath happening in the trucking industry as far as companies shutting down and drivers really trying to figure out kind of what to do next. So we've got all of these things happening, and then we throw on top of it the issues that are plaguing the railroad industry. We've got, very famously, a number of these derailments and issues. We've got longshoremen at any given time on the precipice of a strike at the West Coast ports. It's just sort of all the way around a rough situation with no great answers. And it's compounded by the fact that we have no real leadership at the top that can help sort of organize and herd all of these cats.
Before we get back to the domestic stuff, which you just brought up, I want to focus on China for a moment, because I was thinking you're talking about people who are full on goods. Stores are full on goods, so they don't need as many goods, so the orders aren't coming in. Well, our stuff gets made in China. Surely this is hurting China, who's making things people aren't buying.
It hurts them in one way, but it also, they've got a bit of a floor in China from a manufacturing side, and that floor is set by export subsidies. That floor is set by other indirect subsidies. In some cases, it's forced labor in the supply chain. There's a huge offset for a lot of industries, particularly ones that are dependent on coal, because so much of the coal mining that's done in China is done with free labor, prison labor, internal migration, people that, basically indigent people that are moved from one part of the country to another just to slave away and extracting rare minerals, extracting coal, all of these things. So they've got all of these subsidies built in, where a collapse in demand in the US has a very direct impact on the companies that really keep our economy going. But because China is not a market economy like ours, China is this really odd hybrid of state and private market and public markets. And they're far more direct in their intentions, as far as saying people have to work. We're a communist country. We have to keep jobs going. We have to keep the machines turned on. And then they sort of just choke down the times that causes an overabundance or oversupply of materials. And they keep companies afloat and keep them going. And to the extent that they do allow companies to close in China, those are the politically disfavored ones anyway. They shut them down, the companies go out of business, and then the assets are usually sucked up by some state-owned company, and they just expand again as soon as they can.
Deb Haaland, speaking of China, she was just interviewed she was giving testimony to Josh Hawley, and man alive, we really have the dumbest people in the country in charge. Here's how this went.
The metals needed to make the lithium-ion batteries in those vehicles are, of course, lithium, nickel, graphite, and cobalt. Now, can you tell me what nation is the largest producer of refined lithium in the world?
No, I can't.
It's China. Can you tell me which nation is the largest producer of refined cobalt in the world?
No, Senator.
It's China. Do you know what nation is the largest exporter of natural graphite to the United States globally?
No, Senator.
It's China.
Okay.
Ross, that kind of seems like a big deal for a nation that's geared its entire economy and its military towards going green.
Yeah, at the end of the day, what we saw throughout the 80s and 90s is China went from an economy that said, and China does have an abundance of a lot of these resources themselves, not all of them, but an abundance. It's a very mineral-rich country in some cases and within certain sectors. But what they did was they said, okay, we're going to move upstream from this artisanal mining, this people with pickaxes chipping away at the sides of mountains, and then we're going to start refining. And they got into the refining game. And then they got into the value add game by attracting companies, most of them American and European, to come to China and set up factories with the promise of cheap labor, no environmental regulations. Nobody really cares about the water. And it was, as that happened, this transfer of intellectual property happened under the joint venture agreements, and China then suddenly started competing with their own joint ventures by setting up wholly indigenous companies, and now they control so much of it. And once they began to get into the game of they can control the entire value chain of processing and manufacturing and then converting these minerals and resources into useful, intermediate goods and useful, ready to go to market goods, being able to sell them. Now all of a sudden they control the entire value chain. It's almost like you have no choice. If you utilize lithium, if you utilize a lot of these things, you've kind of got to be in China, and you get locked into this just, death loop of being stuck inside the communist world. And it's very difficult to get out. It's difficult to extract the IP, what hasn't been stolen. It's difficult to extract your capital equipment and reshore. So, when Senator Hawley's talking about it's China, we're never going to get ahead by playing the game of this all by the rules that China themselves set. We have to conceptualize things differently and really understand that this is for keeps, and that we are not in a tension of mutual economies here. We're in a tension of one economy that's playing to destroy the United States and bring us to heel. And we're thinking that this is still just about dollars and cents.
All right, finally, domestically. Okay, so if I understand you right, we have potential port problems with the strike. Everyone knows about the rail problems. Everyone with the television set knows about the rail problems. We have a trucker problem as well. That sounds like a crisis situation for a nation that has inflation and interest rate problems on top of it. Is this a crisis situation?
I think we've gone past crisis, and we're somewhere into a terminal death spiral of a number of these industries. The good news is, and there is always good news, is that we are Americans. We have been through incredibly hard times before that would have broken or crushed a lot of other countries, and we came roaring back. And sometimes the mechanisms by which we come roaring back are really painful and desperate and difficult, and these transitional periods are very tough. But at the end of the day, I will never stop believing in sort of the natural capacity of America for self-renewal. I believe that we have the systems and the resources and the people at the grassroots level. And, we've become dumber and dumber and more obsessed with TikTok and more obsessed with the sport-like drama of politics. But difficult times, like truly difficult times where we realize how far bad we've let things go, it does galvanize a people. And I do think enough leaders and enough common sense will emerge from all of this, that if the next 5 or 10 years is tough, it's also a tough in a way that's laying the foundation for a really, really, really strong and amazing decades to follow.
Do you enjoy watching that? Would you like some more of me? Good. Go subscribe to my YouTube channel. You will enjoy it.